today's webinar. I'm Amaranta from the technical support. I just want to let you know that you have your chat and the Q&A buttons on the bottom of your screen. So if you want to ask any question, do not hesitate on clicking in the Q&A or on the chat. Also, you have the interpretation button on the bottom of your screen is the globe icon. You can activate the English interpretation or French interpretation. Thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Miyoko.
Thank you, Amaranta. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the third and the last of the webinar series on the use of learning assessment data in the education planning cycle. I am Miyoko Saito, the head of training and education program at the UNESCO IIP. I will be moderating the session today. Now, let's go to the next slide. During the first webinar 2 weeks ago, you may remember that we examined the modalities and obstacles of the use of learning data in the education planning cycle. Then last week, during the second webinar, we looked at the assessment policies and institutional settings for the use of learning assessment data. Today, for the third webinar in this series, we will be looking at the dynamics between actors and the use of assessment data, including international actors and national actors at the different levels. In particular, we will be interested in different questions. Now, here are the speakers that you can see on the screen for today's session. As usual, we will be starting with the presentation of the main IIP study findings from a comparative perspective. Then we will have two presentations highlighting the country experiences, 2 countries on international and national actors, interactions at different levels and how they affect the use of learning data. Today, the 2 countries features are from Guinea and Senegal. And at the end, we will have a presentation by the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. After we hear from all the speakers, we will take some time to take your questions. So please make sure to put your questions, as mentioned by Amaranta a while ago, through the chat channel or the Q&A channel. I will be introducing speakers just before each of the presentations. So now let me introduce our first speakers. Yeva Raudonit is an associate research officer and the coordinator of the IIP's research program on the use of learning assessment data in the planning cycle. Tuamanaya Fuamapasfisi is an education consultant and contributed to the implementation of the current research program on the use of learning assessment data. So Yeva and Tuamanaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Miyoko. I'm very happy to welcome you all in this last session of our 3 webinar series on the use of learning assessment data. And before we jump into today's session, I would like to briefly go back to some of the aspects that were covered in webinar 1 and 2. If we could maybe go back to the previous slide. Yes, thank you. So if you were with us in the previous weeks, you may remember that in the webinar 1, we looked at the use of learning assessment data in different phases of the planning cycle. And then we started exploring dynamics among factors that influence this use. We first looked at the quality of assessment reports, and we also explored the issue of dissemination of assessment findings. In the second webinar, we looked at the institutionalization of assessments, and we started with a very important issue of capacity development, emphasizing just how important it is for the sustainable development of assessment systems. We also explored the issue of a lack of coherence and complementarity among some large-scale assessments in countries. And we then looked at assessment policies and different preconditions that are important for their effective implementation. We also looked at institutional settings for assessment teams and their potential advantages and disadvantages. If you missed these sessions, or if you would like to watch them again, their recordings as well as all presentations are available on the Learning portal. And today we're speaking about the dynamics between actors and the use of assessment data. I would say that this is one of the most interesting and yet the most complex aspect that our study has addressed. After we conducted a literature review at the inception of this project, it became clear that the development of learning assessment systems is not a neutral technical exercise, but rather a highly political one with inherent power relations. Different authors emphasize that assessments are a political phenomenon that reflects the agendas, tensions, and nature of power relations between political actors. Assessments often initiate in political processes, and they are also mechanisms to hold actors accountable. This is why we studied the political economy of the use of learning assessment data. And our study demonstrated that it is very important to analyze dynamics among actors because they might, to a large extent, affect the use of learning assessment data. In today's presentation, Tom and I and myself will first of all look at the role of international partners. We'll then turn to dynamics among national actors involved in national large-scale assessments at central level. And then we'll turn to the dynamics between the central and decentralized levels. I would now like to start with the important role that international partners played in the development and support of large-scale assessments. And we can move to the next slide. And we can see that they provided crucial technical and financial support for these assessments. And they were also often important advocates for a more efficient use of assessment data. In the countries that we worked in, international partners often initiated a rollout of large-scale assessments and also provided funding. For instance, in Ghana and Guinea, external partners financed all large-scale assessments, and a large part of assessments in Senegal have also been funded by external resources. Our study demonstrated, and we can go to the next slide now, our study demonstrated that the impact of international partners' support to assessments largely depends on the contextual in-country factors. We saw that different dynamics emerge, and we try to trace the different factors that lead to different balances in assessment systems. We saw that in some cases, partner support resulted in mutually beneficial relationships that strengthened assessment systems. However, in other contexts, their influence was so strong that sometimes it overstepped the national autonomy in assessment data management and limited the national ownership of learning data. In today's presentation, we're trying to show that although external partner support remains essential for learning assessment systems in sub-Saharan Africa, there are certain risks and unintended consequences that need to be considered just as solutions to counterbalance them. In the countries that we worked in, we saw that there is currently no adequate national budget provision for learning assessments. We can go to the next slide now, and we see these two issues that I will develop now. So there is this strong dependence on external funding that sometimes leads to the discontinuity in assessment implementation. Because if there is no external partner behind a certain round of assessment, sometimes it is hard for national counterparts to take over the financing, which sometimes leads to the cancellation of certain rounds of assessments. For instance, this happened in Namibia with a national large-scale assessment that was canceled for 2016 and 2019, as well as, for instance, with the discontinuity of agro-assessment in this country. We also saw that partners have important influence on assessment modalities that are not always fully in line with the data needs of countries. A vivid debate exists on the question of census-based versus sample-based assessments that, of course, have very important cost implications. We also saw in last week's webinar that there is a lack of national technical capacities that sometimes leads to the outsourcing of the most difficult assessment tasks to international agencies, data contractors, or universities, sometimes outside the country. And while this might help palliate a lack of national technical capacities, this entails a number of important risks, because it is difficult to ensure a transparent and inclusive process of data management if parts of these processes are outsourced to another country, for instance. This also leads to a disruption of a national management cycle and reduces the influence that national actors have over the management of data. These two sets of issues lead to a decreased national autonomy in assessment management. They can limit the national ownership of learning data and finally negatively affect the use of assessment results. We can go to the next slide now. And we saw that in countries that we worked in, this lack of a national ownership over assessment results has been raised as an important issue. And this actually points to the misalignment between data production and data use. Some interviewees underline that currently there is a certain imbalance of the use of this data by international and national partners. While international partners heavily rely on this information to inform their projects and their activities, national partners do not always use this information to the same extent. Finally, although a lot of interviewees underline just how important learning assessment data are to inform policies, for some of them, assessments remain seen as a procedure rather than a useful tool that can inform their everyday work. And this perception was especially strong at the decentralized level and for actors that may be involved in the implementation of assessments, but not necessarily receive relevant feedback on assessment results. The issue of national ownership of learning data has been very much raised in Guinea, where a number of interviewees mentioned that the current analysis that is made of learning assessment results is not always relevant to the needs of the ministry. And this is mostly because the ministry has very limited control over the assessment design. This issue was also raised in Senegal with regard to international assessments, mentioning that sometimes they do not fully reflect the realities in the classrooms. There are other two important issues that I would like to address today, and these are linked to issues of sustainability and the emergence of national leadership. We can go to the next slide now. As assessments are often introduced as external projects that are by definition time-bound, sustainability concerns emerge, and we saw in our study that it is sometimes difficult to take over the funding of assessments for national governments. Another issue also exists when countries try to implement policies that might have been recommended by assessment results. Sometimes, if there is no external funding available, it is not possible to implement those policies, which leads to their selective implementation. We also observed an issue of poor coordination among actors that might be funding and coordinating different assessments in country, and this was very clear in Senegal, for example. Another thing that is very important is the national leadership in the assessment systems. The national leadership is important not only to make sure that assessments address the data needs of countries, but also it is key to bring different actors to work together on assessments and to ensure sustainable development of assessment systems. However, they saw that a number of obstacles emerged for this to happen. For instance, limited capacities and financial resources, but also competition among teams in charge of assessments. We saw last week that sometimes different assessments are in the hands of different units. And if their relationships are those of competition rather than those of collaboration, this might impede the emergence of national leadership. And finally, if there is a distrust in national assessment teams' capacities and authority, this might also negatively affect this emergence of leadership. But also our study documented some facilitating factors and some conditions that can lead to a more mutually beneficial relationships. So we saw that the political leadership and internal push to develop the system are very important, just as commitment to develop national capacities as opposed to the outsourcing of different assessment activities. It is also crucial to involve different national actors at different administrative levels in the management of learning data in order to increase their familiarity and possibly ownership of learning assessment results. Finally, it is important to ensure that learning assessments respond to questions that policymakers currently have and that they are in line with education systems' priorities. And I would like to end with the issue of the culture of evidence that our study also explored. And that is difficult, of course. It was difficult to study it, and it's even more difficult to report on it. But we saw that the use of assessment data is embedded in a more general organizational culture, and that learning assessments introduce new practices and views on the management of education systems. And then this needs to find a favorable environment to be adopted, and this environment takes time to build. We also saw that countries have gradually overcome political fears of numbers or distrust in reporting and speaking about sometimes disappointing students' results to embrace more transparency, which, for instance, we saw in Ghana and Zambia. I will now give the floor to Tomanaya that will address the dynamics of national actors at a central level, and we're also switching to French. So our Anglophone audience, please make sure you've selected the English interpretation channel at the bottom of the screen.
Merci Eva. Donc, notre étude s'est intéressée.
Thank you, Eva. Our study was also interested in the dynamics underlying the interactions of the central stakeholders in the ministries of education.
Donc, cette étude nous a démontré que la
And this study highlighted the fact that cooperation was quite limited at the central level. But nevertheless, one must note that it is something that is difficult to measure, and that collaboration or cooperation is not a problem which is specific to assessments or to the ministries of education. But our study shows that it remains a major factor and a relevant factor which needs to be taken into account when you want to explain the fact that learning data are not widely used. The first characteristic of this collaboration is that stakeholders often work in silos, either with teams with similar responsibilities in different assessments, or between the assessment teams and other services such as planning, the curriculum, or the pedagogical team. These stakeholders often take to work in isolation without really sharing systematically the information related to assessments. What you need to know is that information sharing is not always institutionalized, or when this is the case, it is not implemented according to existing regulatory frameworks. But one has to note that the institutionalization of collaboration is not sufficient as a condition, because in some countries you have institutional mechanisms existing which create opportunities to collaborate, but this is a collaboration which is not widely developed, and it does not create more sustainable relationships within the different services. And the third point, which is related to what I've just said, is that the different steps in the management of data remains within the assessment teams. And we've seen during the last webinar that the participation and the contribution of the different stakeholders in this process also helps to add value to these data and use them more efficiently. And all these elements show that there are weaknesses in this collaboration, and therefore a lack of constructive dialogue regarding the results of these assessments, and also when it comes to find remedial solutions to these weaknesses. We've tried to explain why this collaboration was low, going beyond the formal elements and looking at the deeper causes, which means, as we said earlier on, the cultural aspects which may exist in the ministries. And of course, you have environments which are more favorable to collaborations. And in Gambia, for instance, there is a culture, an open door culture, which really exists in the country. In other words, stakeholders will exchange informally and will not hesitate on calling their colleagues if they need more information. And there are other cases where these interactions rather take place in a more competitive environment between the different services with similar responsibilities, despite the fact that institutionally they are related. So this competition between the different services encourages the instability of the institutional framework in which these stakeholders operate. And another point which also highlights how important the perception of the stakeholder is the fact that they believe that there is a division between technicians and policymakers on the other hand. And this leads them to consider that assessments are more technical and therefore should be managed by the technicians, while the political decisions are in the hands of policymakers, and they may decide or to use or not to use the assessment data. Well, of course, the assessment teams must remain quite impartial and not be influenced by the political elements, but this disconnects the assessments from the political decision-making process rather than turning it into sustainable characteristics. And therefore, one of the person we interviewed said, go back to the assessment team and ask them why they carry out such assessments. And the third point, which characterizes the situation, is the collaboration in the different ministries, is that how difficult it is to have a clear leadership when it comes to assessments. In other words, you don't have any reference unit or service which could coordinate the work of different services working on assessments, and which would also be able to create or to generate a common understanding of the assessments and their objectives. So we will now focus on the dynamics between the central and decentralized levels, and this once again gives us quite interesting information regarding the use of assessment data. The first thing you need to know is that the decentralized level is crucial when it comes to the assessment tests in the schools. But when we look at the other steps in the management process, we realize that they are very seldom involved. And the second point is that even if you have assessments which give information at their level, in other words, assessments on the overall population or decentralized assessments as you may find them in Senegal, they have this information but don't know how to use it in their own planning activities. All this finally leads to a lack of awareness and use of assessment data. For instance, in Guinea, when the decentralized players had a problem making a difference between national assessments and national exams. So when they were asked questions about the assessment of learning data, they often referred to exams since they were more familiar with exams. And this naturally leads to the fact that the assessment data are not widely used at the decentralized level. This is part of a more global situation. The evaluation assessments remains highly centralized from design to down to the analysis, and it's mainly the players at the central level. So the decentralized level does not really play a major role. It's rather a passive role, because even if they receive some guidelines, their needs are not often taken into account. So rather than a constructive dialogue, what we see is a set of criticisms between the central and the decentralized level, where the decentralized level criticizes the people in the central level for not being aware of the difficulties they are faced with on the field. And on the other hand, the central level criticizes the people at the decentralized level not to properly use the assessment data while they actually get these data. So what we see is that, generally speaking, there is a lack of loop feedback, i.e. a retroactive loop between the central level and the decentralized level regarding the use of assessment data. So for the central level, the first step in this loop is the assistance in the test. You have some workshops in some countries organized to familiarize people with the standards and the procedures of this exercise. But once the tests have been carried out, they very seldom get any feedback on the assessment results as such and the assessment reports, and on the way the tests took place, just to see whether there were any specific conditions which may have an impact on the validity of the data. But more important even is that even if the decentralized level has the assessment data, there is not enough support from their colleagues in the ministries to help them use these data as best as possible. At the decentralized level, as we said earlier on, they administer these assessments and they send back the tests once they have been completed. And in some cases, as in Namibia, for instance, the regional officers report on the learning performances in their own area based on these assessment data. But when it comes to assisting and following, monitoring the use of data in the schools, or just to monitor the recommendations and their implementation, they're faced with some major difficulties. And these difficulties are mainly material difficulties, because they don't have the financial and material resources to make sure that all the activities are carried out and monitored appropriately. And the other point is also their needs in skills, because at the decentralized level, they have really great needs for capacity development. This leads to the fact that it would be necessary to have a stronger support from the central level as well as from the international partners, who should really support the decentralized players who are close to the schools. And as one of one person said, it's not sufficient to publish data. You also need to have some research behind that to make sure that the assessment data are efficiently used and that the recommendations are implemented as planned. I will now give the floor back to Eva.
Thank you very much, Manaya. And I will just end with a couple of ways forward. Just to let you know that we are currently preparing a comparative analysis on the main study results that we have presented during these 3 webinars. So we'll have them in a written form published later in the year. And we also hope to capitalize on the data that we collected in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also on the data that was collected by our colleagues in Latin America, to have cross-regional lessons learned and recommendations. So I'll stop there, just to say that if you have any questions about the study, its results, or our future initiatives, please do not hesitate to contact us. And I now turn back to Miyoko, who will introduce our next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva and Manaya. We saw that in your presentation that there are so many actors, international actors, that have made some, very important roles, such as capacity development, assessment design, the financing, and advocacy for the use of learning assessment data. But it is really interesting to note that even with the same level of international influence, the country context and their, the readiness in terms of the culture of evidence, which would, of course, take time to develop that, would make really the difference in terms of how the country would have the ownership of assessments, the different types of assessment, and then how the actors can communicate and collaborate in terms of the use of the data. So that was very interesting. Thank you very much. Maintenant, je vais parler en français.
Now I'm going to speak in French, and we are going to look at the first case of Guinea. This will be a presentation made by Djenabou Baldé. Djenabou Baldé is in charge of the Advanced Studies Department of the Institute of Education Sciences in Guinea, and she's also the national coordinator of the Education Research Network for West and Central Africa. Djenabou, you've got the floor, please.
Djenabou?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving me the floor. First of all, I would like to thank IIEP, who has invited me to present. I was, in fact, the inception of this study. I'm going to share my screen with you to show you the presentation.
Voilà. Donc, il m'a été demandé
right. I was asked to give a presentation on the influence of partners and the dynamics between the national actors in Guinea in the planning cycle.
Donc, il faut que je... Non. Voilà. Voilà donc le plan de mon intervention. Je voudrais
So this
parler
is my plan. I would first of all give you some background information, then I'll speak about the support of international partners in developing assessment systems and the effect on the current use of learning data. I will also talk about the influence of dynamics between the national stakeholders, both at the central and the devolved levels on the management of learning data, and I will conclude. Now, with regards to the background information, now what we can see from the various assessments is that you've got there are three types, the different types. You've got the national one for mathematics and French. It's been there since 1998. You get the funding from Education for All, and then you've got the funding from the pooled fund for basic evaluation. Now, this is national evaluation, and this is done at the national level. You also have other types of assessments, like PASEC. Now, we say that this is a regional assessment, but it's more of an international one, in my opinion. So you've got PASEC, which is a program on the analysis of education systems, and you've got EGRA as well. So this is an assessment for reading assessments. So these are assessments that are carried out at the international and regional level. You also have other assessments, learning assessments that are standardized and ad hoc, that are carried out by various types of partners that are pursuing your project, the development project. And we will see what these partners are doing to support this assessment. Now, even if we look at the national assessments or the regional or international assessments, we can see that these assessments are funded by the development partners. So none of these assessments are funded by the national budget, national development budget. So there's a complete absence of assessment policy. There is no policy in the country for assessment. So we're going to try and see how to regulate this in the future. So we've got support from international partners to develop assessment systems and its effect on the use of assessment data. You've got to bear in mind that technical and financial partners require learning assessments, and they're the ones who fund these learning assessments as well. Sometimes they're also producing learning assessment data. So they're the ones who choose the assessment modalities. For instance, the grade at which the assessment will be conducted and the steering indicators that they will choose. So even the indicators are chosen by the technical and financial partners depending on depending on their project priorities. There could be other assessments that could be carried out by the financial and technical partners. And you have, these are evaluations that are conducted at small levels, at lower levels in schools. So again, these are schools that are under the intervention zone, that come within the intervention zone. And they carry out assessments at this level. Now, this is the case of UNICEF that carries out specific assessments depending on the needs. And they carry out assessments where they bring in the national bodies, the national services, and this is the case in the International Convergence Program, where there are 49 townships involved and where there is an assessment being carried out, and this is funded by UNICEF. So UNICEF also carries out assessments at the level of the Tilimele prefecture, and Tilimele is just one prefecture in a region, but the assessments are only done in Tilimele. So when we see all this, you also have the World Bank that carries out its assessment to measure the impact of training and performance bonus. Now, there are 420 schools involved, and all these assessments are done by partners, and they're the ones who determine the class to be evaluated, the level at which the evaluation and the assessment was carried out, and the indicators that should be used. So we were asking the following questions. What is the complementarity and the consistency amongst these various assessments? Now, all these assessments are not carried out at the national level. Some of them are at the regional level, and some of them are actually done at a very, very local level, not even at an administrative region level. For in Guinea, we've got 8 administrative regions. So within an administrative region, we carry out an assessment in just one prefecture in that particular region. So again, we are basically raising questions on the relevance of these assessments. Are these assessments really relevant for the general educational system, or is it just for the donor or just the financial and technical partner who are doing this assessment for their own reasons? And then again, the intervals at which these assessments are carried out. How? Because there is absolutely no autonomy for the national actors. And if the funding is basically dependent on the financial technical partners, you perhaps need to ask questions on how regular, on what regular basis will this assessment be carried out. And the data that's going to be obtained will be extremely fragmented, because this is not data coming from a national assessment. And it really does not give you a proper snapshot of the education system in general, but a very, very specific regional snapshot. And how can this assessment be integrated into the national planning system? So again, we really wouldn't know how useful this data is going to be. Are we not going to be a very fragmented? Are we not going to have a very fragmented education system that is completely owned by different partners and governed by different donor priorities? So again, there's a question of leadership. There's a question of the relevance of the entire system. So again, if we look at the influence of dynamics between the national players and involved in the management of learning assessment data, now we're talking of players at both national and devolved levels. So at the central level, we can see that there is a silo-based structure within the ministry, and I spoke about various cases of assessments that are done in the country. Now, for national assessments, where we're talking of the skills of students in mathematics and French, which is supported by Education for All or by the Pooled Fund for Basic Education. Now, all this for all assessments for PASEC, for instance, we have a committee or a commission that's going to work on that, and we basically call upon the education officials from the country, and we also add officials from other departments. So from the Bureau of Strategic Development. So these are the officers working. Now, if you take EGRA, EGRA again brings in another structure, another body, which is the National Institute of Research and Pedagogical Research. So you see there are several stakeholders who work with evaluation and assessments. So we wondering, why do we have such a heterogeneous snapshot? Now, since all this is not covered by the national budget, you see there is some kind of competition amongst these different bodies. So which department is going to be the spearhead, so to speak? There's going to be competition issues. So you have no autonomy of national players, and this basically is a big impediment in making progress in learning assessment data. Because if they don't have budget, if they have no budget, they can't do anything. So they really cannot carry out assessments when there is no budget, and especially if these assessments have been planned regularly. So when you use data coming from exams is effective because it's only at this level where you have all players participating from the school right to the national level. So you have a list of people who are sitting the exam, the students who are going to sit the exam, and then you also have the various prefectures and all the exam boards at all levels also will work with the system, with the central level, in order to conduct these exams. Now, this is funded by the state. The budget is there. So the data that comes from all this is basically a national data giving a true reflection of the system. Everyone's working on this. So the analysis of the exam, of the results of the exam, is done at all levels. And this is precisely why this is extremely useful. And this is what is useful in the database. So everything that's done in planning is basically inspired from this data coming from exams. So this is precisely why when we talk of data coming from learning assessment, we're talking of data that comes from exams, because this is the data that's used by the system. And what we can also observe is that the staff in the devolved levels do not participate in the assessments. They do not participate at all. And in some cases, we basically all the tools basically come from the central level, and they are sometimes the staff is sometimes sent to the different sites with the tools from the central level, and they're really not involved, and there is absolutely no feedback that is provided on what is done. So it's really very difficult. And then people have to take ownership of all this, so it's hard. And there's absolutely no popularization, and the assessment reports are not accessible at all. Let me just give you an example. So now everyone who's doing a master's and a doctorate degree do not have access to these reports. Even when you go to the national level to have access to some data, we say that the person does not have an official order, so he doesn't have access to this. But this is all public data, so they should really be accessible by one and all. And we really do not have public access to this public data, strangely. And this creates problem because at the devolved level is completely disconnected from what's happening at the central level. And as you said previously, you really need to basically ask people who are doing it. Geneviève, sorry, could you please conclude? Yes, in a while. So I'm going to conclude just in a very short span of time. Now, in my conclusion, first of all, I would like to stress on the importance of developing a regulatory or a normative framework that on the production and use of learning data. And this has been planned in the 10-year education program in Guinea, the 2020-2029 10-year program. So this would be a reference document. We must also ensure that the devolved structures are involved in the production and use of learning data. If you really want to talk about the use of learning data, which is not the case currently, I really think capacity building must be done. This is something that is cross-cutting, and capacity building should be done at all levels, from people who produce learning data to people who use the data as well. And again, the communication really must be factored in if this data must be used. And for communication to be factored in, we really should have accessible reports at all levels. If these reports are not accessible, the purpose is defeated. And if these reports are too technical, only experts would be able to use it. So the reports must be popularized for ensuring wide access. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you, Jenabu. Thank you for addressing various challenges as an absence of an assessment policy. and lack of complementarity amongst various assessments, lack of autonomy. And all this is extremely important for the capacity building and everything. And also, you really have to factor in certain aspects in preparing the report. So, thank you. We're going to move on to Senegal, and we've got Winnie Yondo. Winnie is a statistical engineer and an economist. She's an education consultant for UNESCO, and she specialized in learning assessments and planning in education systems and in the professional integration of people in Africa. So you've got the floor, Winnie. Thank you, Miyoko. I'd like to share my screen.
Alors, ma présentation porte sur...
My presentation will focus on the interaction of national and international stakeholders in the learning assessment system in Senegal. So first of all, since 1995, Senegal has taken part in several national and international assessments, such as the SNRES, PASEC, EGRA, PISA-D, Jangondu, and standard and harmonized evaluations. Now, there are several stakeholders involved in the management of these assessments, and these actors are resident central in several levels, at the central and at the regional level. We also have international players as well, who are the technical and financial partners. At the central level, you have the INEAD, which is the National Institute for Study and Action for the Development of Education. Now, they are in charge of learning assessments such as the SNERS, PASEC, and INEAD also participates in evaluations in assessments such as PISA-D, EGRA, and other assessments commissioned by the technical and financial partners. At the central level, you also have the DEPRI, which is the Education Planning and Reform Division. They come under the Ministry of Education. They participate in assessment called PAKIB, and they're in charge of producing statistics. They produce national statistics on education, and they also use learning assessment data in education planning. Then you also have the LART, which is a research lab on social and economic change. Now, this lab is in charge of the Jagandu assessment. Now, at the devolved level, you've got the inspection divisions and the inspection of education and training that participate in the implementation of tests such as SNERS, EGRA, PISA-D, and PASEC. They also organize standardized tests and pre-tests. With regards to international players, you've got the World Bank, the RTI, USAID, the Hewlett Foundation, and the French Development Agency. These are the main international actors who provide technical and financial support to all international assessments carried out in Senegal and also for Django. Now, in spite of the various stakeholders involved, you must bear in mind that there is a total absence of a policy on learning assessment that must define the assessment objectives and the strategic vision of the system. Now, this absence of policy has led us to raise several questions. How is the data collected? How is the data used? How do various partners interact in this context? When you have to implement a policy that comes from something that's observed. So again, it's really important to understand the support of technical and financial partners, the influence of the support of technical and financial partners on the development of assessment systems and the use of learning assessment data, then the influence of the dynamics between the various national stakeholders in the use of learning assessment data, and how to improve the inclusion of learning assessment data in the education systems. Now, with regards to the international financial partners, you have to know that these financial and technical partners fund and provide technical assistance to most of these assessments. It means that they have an influence on the intervals at which certain assessments are carried out, like the SNERS, SNERS, and when they implement a test, they do not take into account the government, the national priorities, the priorities of the Senegalese government. You also have to bear in mind that the learning assessment data are used as performance indicators linked to the disbursement of funds in various projects. So the current use of learning assessment data by the technical and financial partners is oriented for monitoring and evaluation or for accountability. This data is underused and not used to solve certain problems that are observed in the system. And the data does not reflect the context. You also have to know that there are certain overlappings in between the financial and technical partners. So you have certain assessments that have the same objectives and that are conducted pretty much during the same period. Moreover, the assessments are not always harmonized because these assessments often have a personal agenda. The Ministry of Education does not necessarily have its say when it has to organize assistance provided in light of its own objectives. With regards to the influence of dynamics amongst national actors on the use of learning assessment data, we've observed in our study that INEAD, which is the National Institute of Study and Action for the Development of Education, works in cooperation with the DPRE, which is the Education Planning and Reform Division, and the Elementary Education Division. But we have problems with the teams in the National Education Information and Management System and the Exams and Competitive Exams Board. So the relations between INEAD and these two bodies are not smooth, whilst all these bodies must interact properly in order to better use the learning assessment data. Moreover, the results of this data is often used with a time difference, and this is due to the delay observed in transmitting data from the central level to the devolved levels. And in spite of dissemination of learning data from the central level to the inspection departments, it is less targeted and less effective because in the Institute of Education and Training, because teachers do not have access to the results, to the reports of the learning assessment data in their school.
Le dialogue technique aussi de cette donnée reste limité.
Sorry, the speaker is inaudible. The technical dialogue is limited both at the central and decentralized level. At the central level, we have agents, technical agents, who can use the learning data, but we have noted that these skills are not fully used. At the decentralized level, most of the agents who are in charge of the assessments and data analysis have not received an appropriate training to use the data. And they have shown that they need to improve their skills, the skills they don't have. At the decentralized level, we have noted that not all players are willing to use the data, and the data do not reflect the way schools are operating, and this is the reason why teachers are not willing to use this data, because they don't give enough information. At the decentralized level, you often have global reports with national data, and which do not have disaggregated data that will allow the decentralized level to understand them and to carry out or implement policies so as to solve the problems. Teachers are not also really willing to use these harmonized the assessments, both at the centralized at the secondary level and primary level, and say that it is not in line with the exams that the students are taking and during the test. And when the tests are implemented, students are often late in their curriculum, they're lagging behind, and it does not allow the harmonized development as planned in the curriculum, which generates tensions when it comes to implement an assessment. On the other hand, we have seen different cases of falsification of tests for standardized and harmonized assessments, and some teachers refuse to take the different tests in the assessments and replace them with other exams they have developed themselves. Some teachers also give the answers to the test to their pupils. And these are all reasons which lead to question the reliability of the results obtained at the decentralized level, as well as the lack of supervision, if I may say, from the central level on the decentralized level. Sorry, but the speaker has disappeared. The speaker is inaudible. The interpreter cannot hear the speaker. Right.
Winnie, Winnie, est-ce que vous êtes toujours avec nous?
Winnie, are you still with us? Can you hear me? Says Winnie. Now, yes.
Winnie?
Winnie, yes. Can you hear me? Yes.
Recommandation, parce qu'il n'y a pas beaucoup de temps maintenant.
Can you now give us the recommendations because we don't have much time left? Thank you. Of course.
Comme recommandation, nous proposons d'utiliser de meilleurs canaux de diffusion et de dialogue
As a
technique.
recommendation, we believe that having better the channels to circulate the data and develop a technical dialogue, it would be important. And the ministry should also be able to define the priorities regarding the assessments and the use. There should be more coordination, a better coordination between the technical and financial partners and the Ministry of Education. In addition, the assessment system would benefit from tighter collaboration between the different units involved in the evaluation of the learning data, assessment of the learning data, and the use of these learning data, such as the DPRE, the DE, the DEXO, the CMEN. We also need to develop a more inclusive approach and create more ownership at all levels and use the data at all levels. That brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you, Winnie, for your presentation. We have understood that with your international regional evaluation assessments developed by Senegal, it is very important that the different units and the coordination of the different assessments cooperate to have a complementary vision as to the way they should use the assessment data. So instead of working in silos, in a competitive way. Thank you very much.
Switching to English now. Finally, we have two speakers from the research group called RISE, which is the Research on Improving Systems of Education. Laura Savage from FCDO, which is the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, and Carmen Bilafi. Let me just introduce the two speakers. Laura is a senior education advisor at the FCDO. She's currently the team leader of the education research team of the RISE. And the Carmen is the research associate for the RISE program. So Laura and Carmen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to kick off just with a couple of minutes of overarching comments and then hand over to Carmen to give the technical, sophisticated analysis that it is that RISE do. So I've basically got 3 points that I wanted to cover today. One is what learning data is for. So building on the last couple of webinars over the last couple of weeks, to reiterate that learning data tells us whether the education system is working or not. And this is on the basis that our driving objective of an education system is to enable children to learn. And that reading and writing is an early basic skill that we need them to gain as part of that learning experience. Bottom line is that while we know that there are national learning assessments in most countries, UNESCO estimates that in the majority of countries in Africa and many in Asia, we don't have learning assessment data. We don't know how much these girls and boys are learning in school and how much and not. So learning data is useful. We know that. And we tend to call, I guess my second point is that we tend to call this accountability. We tend to put data into the box of building accountability systems so that, yes, we know whether it's working or not, but we can also hold various different people at various levels of the system to account for whether learning has been improved from the investments we made into these systems. In real life, off paper, in the more political world that we live in, this accountability can translate as blame game. And I've worked in various different education systems where you can feel the blame game at different levels. So teachers and head teachers at the school level can very easily be made to feel like it's a it's a failure if learning gains are not emerging from the students in those classrooms. Parents are blaming them, communities are blaming them, district officials are blaming them. It's bad for motivation, bottom line. And that in itself feeds back as a feedback loop into the accountability structure and system. Staff and ministries of education can feel like their work, all of their efforts to translate policies and programs into learning games, that they're not working, and that's a failure. It's not always clear why. We get learning data, we don't often get proxies of system performance to back that up and explain why. And then there's a system, often as speakers have explained today as well, where donors can come in and fund other surveys, which often show data that is different to those national learning assessments, and it's often much worse data. And that can lead to conversations in country that end up as an our data, your data conversation, which bottom line is not good for the narrative or for the approach to using evidence at all, if we're grappling around and blaming different data sets. So we've got the importance of learning data. We've got the potential for this to end up feeling like it's a blame game. And what do we do about it? So my third point is, part of taking a systems approach to education, part of thinking about education as a system, is recognizing that there's a layer of politics and there's a layer of the political economy of the system that we can't do much about, but we need to go in eyes wide open to thinking about those relationships. And this is where RISE comes in. So Carmen is from the RISE team, which FCDO is one funder of. RISE is a program that over the last 6 years have funded researchers in 7 different countries, in Ethiopia, in Tanzania, in Nigeria, in India, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Vietnam. And it's looking to understand why these education systems, with all of the investment and reforms, have not resulted in learning gains, or indeed if through more recent reforms, if we can identify positive deviance. It's not looking for how to teach children to read, but it's looking at why things don't work at large scale. And I think one of the most important things, as one of the funders reflecting on the success of RISE over the last 6 years, is that it's shown us how deep the learning crisis is, how slow change is, and how much reform is about politics and implementation issues. And data, the politics of data, is one part of this. So Carmen now I'm going to hand over to her. She's going to talk through some of the work on learning profiles that RISE has done. And in my view, this is the sophisticated analysis on learning profiles is some of the biggest work that RISE have done, because it helps as a policymaker like I am, it helps to be able to show where it is that children aren't learning or where they are learning, and what, gives us the ability where the data is available to zoom in and really focus on learning from or tackling issues. Come on, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. That was a fantastic introduction. So I would like to take sort of a complementary view to what was presented throughout this webinar, but go one step back and look at what Yeva today described as this misalignment between data production and data use, and see perhaps how we could use data to create a more positive feedback loop between data and action and between all these different actors in the system. Because it turns out that not all learning assessments are equally informative. And I would like to point to a few characteristics of that. The first is that especially cross-section data of a single age and grade is really about outcomes and not the process. So if you find out that in grade 6, children do not possess basic literacy and numeracy, this does not really tell you where in the process of schooling the problem started to occur. Second, many assessments happen too late in the schooling cycle, so at the end of primary and upwards. And our research really shows that you cannot fix grade 10 by trying to fix grade 9, because the gap emerges and grows over time. Third, many assessments happen through the schooling infrastructure and are therefore in-school measures and not cohort measures. And those in-school measures are bound to underestimate the learning crisis, the bigger the share of out-of-school kids. And just to give you one example of this, so this is PISA-D. And this is really where low learning and low grade attainment come together. And if you look at the right bar here, this shows that the average of the 7 countries that participated in PISA-D, on average, 57% of kids were excluded from the assessment, either because they were out of school or below the required grade level and therefore not eligible to participate. And that means that PISA-D did not even cover the majority of children in the cohort of 15-year-olds. And that, of course, is a problem when trying to address learning in your country and trying to act on it as a policymaker. Now, learning profiles, RISE believes, can hone in on the critical junctures of the learning process and help alleviate some of the problems that I just described. Now, what is a learning profile? At the very basis, it describes how much children learn over time in a specific context. So here you can see on the x-axis, you will have time, so that can be age or grade. And on the y-axis, very generally, it's going to be the learning or the skill. And then ideally, what you want is learning profiles to be very steep early on, because learning is cumulative. But what we see in reality is often very different, and I'll come to that in a minute. But these learning profiles allow us to trace out the trajectory of learning across multiple ages and grades. They help us understand when exactly children start falling behind. They typically cover earlier years of schooling and are usually cohort measures. Several different data sets that are available to us. And they can also help us analyze differences between groups when it comes to learning. And I'll also show an example of that in a minute. Now, what have we learned from learning profiles? And RISE has analyzed learning profiles from over 15 countries and 6 million individuals over the years. And here are some of the general, meta things that we have learned from this. First, learning profiles very often are just too flat for students to achieve, or children to achieve, the SDG 4 goals of learning. And this is what you can see in the orange learning profile that is flat up there. Second, learning varies dramatically across and within countries and even within classrooms. An evaluation of the MindSpark program in India, for example, found that students in grade 8 typically span 5 to 6 grade levels in skills and learning, and are on average 4 years behind the curriculum. And that is just tremendous within a single classroom. Third, learning differences emerge very early. So Young Life's data, for instance, show that this is already significant at age 8. This widens over time and is very difficult to correct later on. And lastly, some of the conventional approaches to addressing the learning crisis often yield very small effects. 2 examples for this. First is the idea that expanding access will improve learning. Now, this can be true in some contexts, but in many contexts where learning profiles are flat, because children learn so little with each year in school, spending more time in school will not improve learning by very much. And second is the idea that closing equity gaps within countries will improve learning. And again, that is true in some contexts and for some groups, but mostly learning levels are just too low overall, even for more advantaged groups within countries. So even if those inequalities were eliminated, still the vast majority of kids would not reach SDG 4. This is an example of a learning profile created by my colleague, Jason Silberstein. So this is using Mix 6 data, that is UNICEF, for Ghana, measuring foundational numeracy. And just 2 quick points I want to make on this. First, you see how flat the profile is. So by grade 4, not even 20% of kids have mastered basic numeracy. And the number doesn't rise very high up, even with more and more years of schooling. And secondly, the difference between boys and girls in this graph is there, but it is very small compared to the gap to universal mastery that you would want to reach, and we all would want to reach. That is much more daunting in this context. Now, how can we close the loop on that? And how can learning profiles help prioritize for learning? First, the good news is that this data already exists for many countries. So I've highlighted a few, but Mix 6, for instance, is now covering more than 30 countries and will expand to over 60 countries by next year. And learning profiles have the advantage of really being able to hone in on problems in the learning process, answering questions such as, when do children fall behind? which children fall behind? And what is the comparison between some of the equity gaps that I just described versus universal learning gaps? And now this can help align actors around a clear set of priorities for an education system. And that is really important. And some of the things that Tuamanaya mentioned earlier in her presentation, where it is really about the central level having leadership, but all the different actors having ownership and a clear delegation of what you want to do in an education system. Because we know from experience, and Louise Crouch, for instance, has done some analysis on this for us last year, we know from research and experience that actors in education systems need to align and set clear goals for their system. And for learning, that mostly entails some goal around foundational literacy and numeracy. And these clear prioritizations and clear delegation can then help systems shift to align for learning. And we've seen this in a variety of different contexts, like Tusome in Kenya, the Tanzania curricular 3R reform, and various other contexts. So in short, learning profiles really have the potential to help actors agree on, firstly, a problem, and then secondly, on a priority course of action. And that overall, in different contexts, has helped to strengthen learning. I've also put in some endnotes. So if you would like to know more about the research, you can find that here. We'll send around the slides, I guess. And we're also available through the conventional channels. And I'm looking forward to your questions now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura and Carmen, for being on time for your presentation. I thought that the important thing about this RISE experience is that the different learning measures from different initiatives are put together in the kind of a continuous way, and then that can be used as a feedback loop that was discussed by Eva and Tuanaya between those who collect the learning data and those who make interventions to improve the learning at the critical time in the school trajectory. So, and I think that this will be even more relevant when these learning measures of the different assessments were more aligned in terms of, in order to measure the indicator of SDG 4.1.1. Yeah. So thank you very much. Now we will have kind of a short time. However, I'm going to give the floor to Lynn, the head of the IIP library and the coordinator of the learning portal, in order to take some questions. Lynn, please go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Miyoko, and thanks everyone for the great presentation. So I'm not sure you can see me very well because of the light. And we've had a lot of questions in the chat and in the Q&A. And before we start, maybe I should just say that those that we can't answer today, we have an online discussion forum which you can join, and we will answer any questions that we don't get round to answering today. So many questions and comments, again relating to capacity building, which came up in the first two webinars. So have some questions and comments on capacity building, and maybe if each of the speakers could take the question in turn. So many speakers mentioned that the learning assessment data are not used efficiently at the decentralized level. And some even mentioned that the national report from the central level is not that useful for the decentralized level use. Can't the decentralized level just use the data at their own level for planning and decision making? And is this a question of capacity? And then we have a participant from Kenya who suggests building capacity of teachers in data production and analysis, and maybe if there are any other solutions that the panelists would like to suggest. So a long question for everyone to take in turn. Thank you.
Okay.
I'll start with IIP. Sorry.
Yep.
Thank you, Lynn. This is indeed a very important question. And unfortunately, we noticed that there is no such learning data analysis that takes place at the decentralized level. As we've mentioned in our presentation, very often decentralized level officials are involved in the implementation of the assessment, but then they transfer the results back to the central level in the form of completed tests. And then the analysis is done at the central level. And what's even more worrying is that sometimes they do not receive the relevant feedback on those results. So I think this is probably the issue of capacities, but also the way the assessments are designed and the data cycle management is also organized in countries. So both these elements are important. I don't know if Tamanaya would like to add anything to this.
Oui.
Yes, absolutely. As Eva said, there's also a problem linked to the design of assessments because some of them are carried out on a sample. So it gives information on the national level, but it's not really relevant for players at the decentralized level because they want to know what is the performance of their pupils. Now, you have the lack of capacity to use this data, but there's also no relevant data for these actors, the actors at the devolved level. So they are turning to national exams that will basically go to the detailed levels, and it would be very regular in time. So this is what I wanted to raise. Thank you. Maybe we could also request Mrs. Balde and Mrs. Yondo to chip in. Yes, I just wanted to, I don't know if you can hear me. Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. I just wanted to say that the use of data at the deconcentrated level, we're looking at how relevant they are. I feel that they are relevant because even if you do sampling, we're going to do sampling in the region. The region, in fact, you've got the prefectures in the regions, in the various regions, and we will be basically covering a part of the region. And that would be a good thing to see what analysis is being done on this region. And this analysis that's been done for that region, we could actually talk about what's been done at the deconcentrated level so that we know what are the results of the analysis. So there was an assessment carried out at a national level. These are the indicators, and these are the indicators for each region. And this is our region, the performance of region, in comparison to the others. So I think it's a good thing because it really gives us an idea on how the region is doing. And basically, if we do this, actors are going to take better ownership of the assessment, and they will make sure that the next assessments would really ensure better performance for their regions.
Okay, thank you. I think we may have lost Madame Yondo. I can't see her. So maybe just then any final comments from Laura and Carmen.
I don't have a huge amount to add. I would say, I think one of the things that RISE has brought out most clearly to me is that most actors within an education system need to be aligned, even on the very idea that foundational learning is the primary goal. And so I think before we even get into the conversations about who needs to measure it, how they measure it, how what sort of data linking it and so on, I think the conversation needs to start with how to get everyone in the system who is a decision maker and has a role in the accountability relationships up and down the system, what the focus needs to be and what the narrative on learning is in that particular context, however that system is defined. Carmen.
Yes, I fully agree with that. And I can maybe add one sort of broader systems point here, which is that the desire for the decentralized level to act in their own context is very understandable because, especially in very complex systems, you're often very far detached from where these priorities are being made. And what we see is that very often in systems, the central level from the top down is just trying to, especially through information, trying to control very tightly what is being done at decentralized levels. And what we see is that, and that doesn't even necessarily only have to do with information, but that is a broader governance question also. How can you have clear priorities and clear delegation, but then also allow flexibility and room to breathe and authority to make local level decisions, right? And that is based on information, but also based on a lot of other things. And that is, in a systems perspective, sort of a balancing act that is very hard to strike for systems in general. And of course, that is also going to be, it's always going to find itself also in the data and information part, but it doesn't stop there. So the authority to really make good decisions includes information, but is not limited to information.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to pass back to Miyoko now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn. Actually, it was a pleasure to have all the speakers today, and thank you very much. We certainly look forward to the next, forthcoming comparative analysis that are going to take place based on the sub-Saharan African studies that were presented in the last 3 webinars. And of course, we will be looking forward to hearing more about the Latin American countries. I'd like to just announce, that IAP will be organizing an online version of the specialized course. I just put the information in the chat. If you are interested in the capacity building opportunity, where you can learn more about how we can use the learning assessment data, you're welcome to join us. With that said, now it's time to close this series of webinars on the use of learning assessment data. It has been a great pleasure to have all of the speakers. And I would like to thank again, not only the speakers, but all the members of the organizing committee for the 3 webinars, as well as the participants who have made the lively, question and answer sessions. And then, of course, our interpreters. So thank you very much. And I wish you all the best. Please stay safe and healthy. Goodbye.